Great to be here, and it's great to see so many women here. I think this is a record, so
Yeah.
congratulations to you all. I was asked to talk a little bit about the structure of organized crime, some of the impacts on the ground, and then think, and Dr. Crockett will be looking more at some of the solutions to be had. Transnational organized crime in Africa, as elsewhere, comes in many, many forms. Some are relatively simple, some are much more complex and opaque. But at the core of all these networks is the principle that drives the global economy, whether in illicit trade or illicit trade, and that's the law of supply and demand. So looking at the supply side, you will want to understand the supply chain and the value chain that links what is demanded from where it is supplied. So that's just a very basic, but in looking at networks where there are very many players, it's still important to keep that simple principle in mind. So on the very simple side, for example, a Chinese fishing trawler moves into water that's under the jurisdiction of Sierra Leone. It meets little resistance, doesn't see anyone. It fills its nets and returns to international waters. No problem, but that's a transnational crime. It's stolen what rightfully should belong to Sierra Leone. Or a ship. I don't know if anyone's here from Côte d'Ivoire. Yeah? Yeah. Or a ship carrying toxic waste, looking for a cheaper place to offload that waste, rejects offers from European companies because they're charging too much, goes down to Abidjan, finds a fly-by-night company that will do it for much, much less, and then it gets dumped into the harbor of Abidjan. And a lot of people get sick from that. That's the Trafigura incident. So those are quite simple structures, almost bilateral, if you will. As you get on land, these value chains tend to get more complex, with more facilitators, more fixers, more middlemen, more logistics teams, and then the foot soldiers at the very bottom of the rung who do much of the work but get little of the pay. A logging company, for example, receives a license to go log in a particular area. It may get the license fairly, but as it goes out into the area, it goes well beyond the area that it was supposed to log in. There's no enforcement. The local people may help because they get some benefit from working for the logging company, and there's very little blowback. Logging company ships the illegal logs out with the legally taken timber, and no one's the wiser because enforcement capacities within that are so weak. The logger may have gotten a license by paying a bit under the table, getting authorities, whether local authorities or national authorities, to look the other way. One thing to keep in mind is that at the heart of many of these transnational security threats and crimes is corruption. It's the lifeblood of the criminal trafficking world, whether it's local authorities, whether it's border authorities, port authorities, national authorities. If we begin to start getting into drug traffickers and wildlife traffickers, these tend to be even more complex. They tend to be segmented with an overarching kind of the controller of the supply chain, often is an international cartel, possibly from Asia, possibly from elsewhere. And segments along that supply chain may have very little to do with one another. So a poaching gang, kind of the foot soldiers in the wildlife trafficking, who are poaching or crueling abalone out of the sea or pangolins, sell to kind of local middlemen, who then are kind of the connector to transporting or even a higher level middlemen. They have to connect with logistics players who bring this to the port where it's going to be shipped. And then you have to have complicit port authorities or complicit legitimate shippers to ship it out to where the eventual demand is. So rhino horn coming from Kruger Park gets passed from level to level. It ends up in a port, perhaps in Tanzania or Kenya. It then ships out. Much of the demand for rhino horn these days is coming from Vietnam. China has had a slight reduction, but Vietnam is now burgeoning. You look at drug trafficking. The cartels, again, that kind of control the trade are Latin American drug cartels, if you're looking at West Africa, who again have local partners, sometimes government partners or local authorities who are willing to look the other way or get paid off. And you have segmented movement up through the Sahel. There may be some models in which a single logistics person moves it through the Sahel, but most often it's segmented and moves piece by piece by piece. Each time the value of the drugs grows a little bit more until it's shipped into the markets of Europe, and its value is multiple times more than when it first entered that West African port. That's the basic model, and it will go for other counterfeit goods. There are some trades coming the other way, or if you look at the east coast of Africa, heroin coming from East Asia, Southeast Asia, coming up through Kenya, Tanzania, the Swahili coast, up through, again, to the areas, to European markets. We think, just to get to the impacts of some of this, a lot of folks that I used to talk to would say, well, we're not taking the drugs. Why is it our problem? It's the Europeans that are having the damage done by the drugs. To some extent, I can understand that. But more and more, we're seeing that some of the payments are being made in drugs. And you're starting to see increased use of cocaine, of cannabis, of drugs like tramadol. Apparently, there's a burgeoning trade in tramadol driven by Boko Haram, whose foot soldiers consume it. Interestingly, in South Africa, abalone, which is a shellfish, is poached. It's illegal to pull it out of the sea. It's poached, and poachers get from the Chinese cartels in return the elements that go into making methamphetamine. And it's called tick in South Africa. And there's a huge epidemic of methamphetamine use in South Africa with really devastating effects. I've known some people who have kind of come under that addiction, and it's just horrifying, losing everything. And it's a national crisis. So you have the human element of this. The poachers have become more and more militarized in their operations. Wild park rangers are often shot by poachers. The communities in which they live become almost criminalized communities and have to defer to the men with arms. Third problem is the idea of convergence that we see more and more, and that these various lines of criminal activity converge in some ways, so that some of the shipping routes may be shipping multiple illicit goods, not just drugs, not just wildlife trafficking, but combined. Ivory shipped out to Asia may be contained in a cargo of tea, but hidden inside. So it taints legitimate trade. And then convergence in terms of the funding that is accrued to people participating in these lines of trafficking can be used for nefarious means. There was a lot of speculation at one point whether al-Shabaab was using ivory to fund itself. The evidence is not at all clear on that, but there is no doubt that ivory sales and poaching have been used to fund the Lord's Resistance Army, the Janjaweed to some extent, and a number of others. Drug trafficking has overlapped in various ways with violent extremism in the Sahel. They may not be completely connected, but they overlap, and you'll have a player who may one day have a foot in the drug industry, another day in the extremist industry. So convergence in that way, and the millions and millions that are made from these trafficking are seriously problematic. The corruption that fuels all of this is also corrosive to the rule of law, to state. Where states are weak, if they are further weakened by informal networks paying them off to serve individual needs, not the needs of the country, so that it kind of corrodes a state from within. And if you have national authorities somehow implicated in the trade, say, of drug trafficking, the national government is not going to have that much incentive to clear the problem up. And so transparency and trying to limit the incentives for corruption from the national level to the very local level is critically important. Finally, just a word, and I tell all my students this. We tend to look for all the problems of this in Africa. It's corrupt African leaders, it's weak states, it's these communities that don't have jobs and have few options, and all that may be true. But that corruption is facilitated and enabled by global actors. Global logging companies, they may be legit, but they're not acting that way. Global shipping companies like dumped toxic waste in Abidjan. I think of corruption, mega corruption, as a transnational security threat. When companies come in, major companies come into a place like DR Congo, they learn clever ways with shell companies and many fronts to move money around, to move it out of the country. Africa loses some $90 billion of money in illicit financial flows every year. Some of it is quasi-legal because they use these rules of not telling who the company belongs to, and all of that ends up in places like the UK, tax havens like Panama, tax havens like Delaware, tax havens like Florida. There's some worse ones, but those are ones that the United States has some control over and hasn't seen fit to do much about. Similarly, with wildlife trafficking, the problem, it's poaching, but the real problem comes from the demand that's happening in China. How do you suppress that demand? There were diplomatic moves made under the Obama administration to try to push China to change its laws on that. Should be noted, the U.S. still has an ivory trade here. It's meant to be an antique ivories, but that means that poached ivory is able to slip into the system. Again, think about what our country, where our responsibility is as well. It's not simply an African problem. It's a problem along the entire value chain. I think I'll stop there and look for some answers.